Hey guys, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and we are trucking along through Christian Theology 101. What are some of the main doctrines of Christianity? And these are specifically the main doctrines that you'll find when you look up through the Bible. Not necessarily a systematic theology, but just what are some of the main things that are over and over and over again emphasized in the Bible throughout the whole thing. And today we're looking at resurrection. So you noticed with the cross that one of the first things that I did was I pointed out that Jesus was the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So the idea of the crucified Messiah comes even from the very beginning, that God, how do I want to word it? God was um, willing to endure suffering at the very beginning, even from the foundation. He had a cross of sorts. Obviously not the physical cross, but he had a cross of sorts even from the very foundation of the world. Today we're looking at the resurrection. And how does this trace from the whole Bible as well? To say that Jesus was raised by the glory of God is to say that you and I have also the same opportunity as well. I mean, this is kind of one of the things, is that Jesus is our pattern. Jesus is the example that we're supposed to live by. And if you really believe that, then you need to take seriously that Jesus died and was raised from the dead. So we know there's the doctrine of resurrection at the end of the age, and we know that the apostles taught that this resurrection has taken place spiritually here and now. So it's both one spiritually and one physically, and both through Christ's resurrection. Now here's where the doctrine and the reality become one. I heard one man say here recently, he was asked by an interviewer, I know that at the end of the age, there's kind of the spiritual answer that you can give, but really physically, how are we supposed to survive the end of the age? And this guy responded and said something like, I'm glad you asked this question, because until the spiritual is the physical, then we will always be asking that question. We've made a schism in our brain where you can read about the doctrine of the resurrection, that we have spiritually been raised with Christ here and now, and yet still say, but I'm still in sin, so I must not be raised. There's a doctrine that we can all hold to and say, yes, that's correct, and have a check mark next to it. I believe in the doctrine of resurrection. And then there's the reality itself, that those who truly believe in it will live it. So the new birth, what is the new birth? The very, quote, new birth that Jesus spoke of in John 3 is a depiction of resurrection. We've once been in sin, in death, and in darkness, but now we've been raised from that sin, death, and darkness. We're no longer, it's a new birth. We've been born again. We're now alive, set free from sin, and in the kingdom of light. So there's a process. I'm wanting to say progression. There's a process that we must go through. We must learn again what it means to live, how to live, the mindsets which we must embrace in this. So when you were first born, you were not able to walk, talk, and feed yourself. You weren't potty trained right from day one. There's a process of growing, of learning how to make your arms move in the direction that you want them to, instead of just kind of flailing about and getting aggravated because you're not able to move them exactly how you want. There are bodily processes that are now taking place that you hadn't had to deal with before, and your body has to become accustomed to breathing air instead of the umbilical cord, and these sorts of things. So there's the same kind of process that must take place with the new birth, that we must take off the old and put on the new, and to learn what it means to live in freedom and to live in this new life that we've been given. It takes time, and it takes devotion, and it takes a desire to live in that. But this is what is necessary. It's a new birth. So the scandal of resurrection is that you and I can now point to our own lives as evidence of Jesus' resurrection. This separates the doctrine from the reality. They who hold the doctrine of resurrection have always tormented and attacked they who hold the reality, expressing the doctrine in that they themselves have been raised with Christ and no longer live in sin and death. So I can look at my own self and I can say, I was once a vehement opposer to God and Christianity. I'm no longer that. I was an anti-theist. I'm no longer that. I was wrapped and shrouded in sexual sin. I no longer am. I once was a liar and a compulsive liar even, and I was full of bitterness and anger, even to the point where I was a terrible friend. But I'm no longer full of bitterness and anger and a liar and etc. I'm no longer like that, even among my friends, or maybe I should say especially. But it used to be that I was a terrible person. I'm no longer that. I can point to the way I was before and I can say, you see that man? I'm no longer that. And it was such a way that when I saw somebody who I used to know in high school before I was a Christian, this is a couple years ago now, but when I met up with them again, I told them, well, I'm a Christian now. And they looked at me and their mouth just dropped. And after a few seconds, they said, "You're a Christian? You?" That is the difference between the doctrine and the reality. When you don't have to tell people, but they can look at your life and they can say, there's something about this person that is utterly different. And that gets me to my next slide here. Martin Luther, who held to the depravity doctrine that all men are depraved, called the Anabaptists demon-possessed. The Anabaptists were demon-possessed, according to Martin Luther, because they lived in a way that was so holy, so pure, there's no way that they could possibly be living like that unless they were demon-possessed, according to Martin Luther. In Switzerland in the 1700s, Anabaptists were tortured, burned alive, and girls were even tied with their hands behind their back, and they were tied together by their hands, and they were thrown together into the river to drown. I mean, this is Anabaptist history. This is what people do to the Distilla and Longda. This is what people do to the quiet ones in the land. To these quiet ones, the holy ones, the ones who are living in a way that is utterly contrary to everything that the religious man says is possible. The religious man who says depravity, sin nature, these things are not overcome. You're only going to find freedom when you've died and when you've gone into heaven. Those who have found freedom and live in that freedom are the ones who are tortured, burned alive, and cast into the river, who are called demon-possessed. The resurrection phenomenon grants power to the one who's raised. This is the scandal. In 1 Corinthians 7 or 1:17, in 1 Corinthians 1:17, as well as in 2:4, we see God's wisdom versus the wisdom of the Greeks and the Jews. The gospel is foolishness to the Greeks, and it's a stumbling block to the Jews. But notice the context of these statements. When you read through the whole context of 1:17 or so, all the way through 2:6, and even all the way to the end of the chapter of chapter 2, you'll notice the context of what Paul's getting at here. It's not about just the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world, but that the demons even have this wisdom, that the rulers of this age follow a wisdom that so doesn't understand the wisdom of God, that if they would have understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, is that the rulers? Is that the Roman authority? Or is that the principalities and powers who ultimately were the ones who manipulated and had usurping power over that authority? You see what I'm getting at here? Okay. So, last slide for resurrection. That which separates the intellectual and scholar from the true doctrine is the legitimate thing, the authentic reality of resurrection lived out in the life of the believer. Anyone can believe that we'll raise at the end of the age, and that Jesus rose from the dead. But do you have faith to believe that even now, while you are still yet in your flesh, you can live according to the resurrection, and therefore be free from sin, death, judgment, fear, and all of these other things? Do you believe that? If so, then I guess as it says in Hebrews 12:6, I quoted this last time, wrestle with sin unto the point of shedding your blood. Get free for freedom's sake. I mean, this is just Salvation 101. You who are free, be free. Don't any longer do the deeds of darkness. Don't any longer put yourself under the subjection of the things that are of death. Don't any longer walk in the ways of sin, which you've been set free from. You who've been made free, continue in that freedom. And that's it's it's that simple. Um, but I've found that there is a block, there's a fuzz, there's a haze over the eyes of people. That when I start talking like this, a lot of the people who are like Martin Luther, who hold to the sin and depravity and etc., you start talking like this and they just don't get it. And that's kind of frightening, to be honest. But that's where we're at, I guess. So next time we'll be looking at the ascension. Grace and peace to you in Christ. Until next time, I bid you farewell.